Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Young Investigator Award Talks. I'm excited to be able to introduce this session because I think it is consistently my favorite part of CNS every year, so it's going to be a really wonderful opportunity. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief, even though there's a lot to say about this award and the people that are getting it, but we want to leave more time for the talks and less time for me. Webster's Dictionary defines the purpose of the CNS Young Investigator Award is to recognize outstanding contributions by scientists early in their career. No, I just got that from the website. But I think this description is actually quite the understatement for what this award really means. Looking at the history of the award, you can see that these just didn't happen to be young scientists that were doing an awesome job in the work that they were doing, but there were individuals that I think were really actually building the lower level scaffold of where the field is going, right? Think about some of the earliest winners. I picked the first four: Randy Buckner, Isabel Gautier, Roberto Cabeza, and Sharon Thompson-Schill. These people, just as an example of the many other award winners, including myself, are shaping what the future of cognitive neuroscience looks like. And you can just see the history of the trainees that come from these labs and the impact that they have. So we're getting this sort of beautiful, almost like future projection of where our field is going by seeing these two talks that are about to happen. So I've been recently dabbling in development, so I wanted to reflect on the word young and what it means in this context, right? And I think defined by the award, they really mean, years since Ph.D. But when I look at the work of both of these people, I take more of a developmental perspective of what young means in this context. And what I mean is that they're both taking risky decisions to explore things that we haven't explored yet. They're integrating information in a way that us older folk can't do with a new lens on them. And they're harnessing creativity in service of growth. And that's exactly what we're going to see today. And it really is two sets of amazing, beautiful work. So before we get started with the talks, I just wanted to announce the award winners and give them their beautiful prize. So let's give a welcoming round of applause for our first award winner, Peter Koch from UCL, who is blurring the lines of perception, expectation, and memory. Congratulations, Peter. Said your last name now. Thank you. Awesome. And let's keep the applause going for Ella Stream Ahmed, who's leveraging diversity in neural development to provide a unique lens of sensory motor systems. And like I said, we're in for a real treat, so let's get this started. And Peter, come on up. I feel like a game show host.
All right, great. Let's get my slides up. Great, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you for this amazing award. Thank you to the committee for selecting me for this award. It's a big honor, and thanks to the Chen Institute for sponsoring it. I was quite baffled to receive the news that I won this award, of course. Also baffled by the word young, as been referred to right during the introduction. And one of the first things I thought when I read about this wonderful news is that maybe the Young Investigator Award should really have gone to this guy, who's doing some investigations of lights and moving pictures. And one thing I also like about this video, that it proves the ecological validity of drifting gratings. All right. So what my research focuses on is how our prior knowledge of the world shapes our perception. And to give you an example, I'll show you a little video. This is a sculpture on the street here in Toronto. I took this video a few years ago and I checked it's still there, next to the AGO. So this is a hollow carving in a slab of stone, as you can see, of a portrait of Vincent van Gogh. And as you walk in front of it, at some point, you may have this illusion that the face kind of pops out of the stone, and you feel like you're looking at a face that's not hollow, but actually comes out at you. And this is known as the hollow mask illusion. It's a very strong and prominent illusion, very robust, and it's presumably driven by the fact that throughout our lifetimes, we're always exposed to faces that are convex and never concave. And this is such a strong prior in our system that it overrides our actual knowledge that we know this thing is hollow. Now, in the lab, we unfortunately don't use stimuli that are as beautiful as that. What we do in our work is we give people cues, for instance, an auditory cue that predicts what they're going to see next, and then we see how that influences their perception and their visual processing. And then what we do with neuroimaging is to probe stimulus-specific representations with high anatomical or temporal precision to see how these representations are influenced by expectations. So to give you a very brief set of highlights of some of the things we've found over the years, we found that prior expectations can evoke templates of expected stimuli without anything actually being presented, specifically in the deep layers of the primary visual cortex, which are strongly associated with top-down feedback. These stimulus templates appear just prior to the onset of the actual stimulus itself, presumably so the stimulus can be intercepted and processed more efficiently. When these expectations are valid, they lead to sharpened stimulus representations, by which I mean that expected stimuli evoke less activity overall, but are represented better in the pattern of activity. And when expectations are invalid and stimuli are noisy, then the representations of these stimuli are biased towards the expected stimulus feature. And this also goes for perception. Perception is biased towards the stimulus feature. So those are some of the things that we found over the years, but today I mainly want to highlight 3 recent questions that we've been asking. Where do these expectations come from? How are expectations kept online in anticipation of a stimulus? And can expectations make us see things that are not actually there? So start with the first question. What is the source of these expectation signals? There's, of course, not just one source of expectation signals, but a lot of the studies that we do involve these cross-modal arbitrary cues, such as a sound predicting what you're going to see next. So clearly the visual cortex can't solve that on its own. There must be some other reasons involved. And if you've been to a symposium we organized yesterday, you won't be surprised to hear that our favorite candidate for this is the hippocampus. Since the hippocampus receives and sends signals from all the different sensory hierarchies, and of course also is known to learn statistical regularities between inputs quickly. And in our studies often these cues are just presented for a few minutes before people enter the scanner, so these must be things that are learned quite rapidly. And what we think the hippocampus might be doing is on receiving a predictive cue, use its pattern completion machinery to retrieve the associated stimulus and send this to the visual cortex as a prediction. And during my postdoc with Nick Turk-Brown, who is here in the audience today as well, we started looking into this using fMRI, and we did find evidence for representations of predicted shapes, predicted by auditory cues, in the hippocampus. And within the hippocampus, these were present in an amalgamated CA2-3 dentate gyrus region, and also very strongly present in the subiculum, which is one of the major outputs of the hippocampus back to cortex. So these were very interesting findings to us, but what we don't know from these findings is, are these prediction signals actually sent back to the visual cortex? And the challenge there is, of course, with fMRI, that directional connectivity is hard to test. But we can make use of some anatomical features of this pathway that we know about, namely that signals from the hippocampus that are sent back to cortex flow through the deep layers of the MTL cortex, as opposed to signals going from the cortex to the hippocampus, which mainly flow through the superficial layers of the medial temporal lobe. So Oliver exploited this known anatomical feature, and he talked about this already in our symposium yesterday, but I'll briefly highlight his results again here. He used 7 Tesla fMRI with sub-millimeter voxels to try to probe these layer-specific signals. The paradigm he used was very simple, where auditory cues predicted the identity of an upcoming shape. But crucially, on 25% of the trials, the screen stayed empty. So there was a prediction of a shape, but no actual shape being presented. He used pattern correlation analysis to test where in the hippocampus, in which of its subfields, do we see a representation of these predicted but omitted shapes. And it turns out that those are present in CA2-3, segmented here separately from dentate gyrus, so a likely candidate for pattern completion, CA3, and also in the pre-impera subiculum. So matching the previous results, but making them more precise even. You may notice that the prediction pattern correlation signals here are negative, which is something that we're still pondering in the exact meaning of, but it might reflect that these predictions are a negative reflection of the actual pattern evoked by presenting a stimulus. So it might be that these predictions are inhibitory. Now, to get back to the question, are these predictions actually sent to cortex? Looking in the medial temporal lobe, we found in the parahippocampal cortex this same pattern correlated prediction signal, and this was most robust in the deep layers of the parahippocampal cortex, but didn't differ significantly by layer. But what we did to test our hypothesis is use an informational connectivity analysis to look at where are these shapes communicated to. I'm not going to explain the analysis. If you'd like to know more about it, you can either trap Oliver somewhere or you can read the preprint. Okay, so, and what we found is that the CA2-3 subfield communicated specifically with the deep layers of the parahippocampal cortex, to a slightly lesser extent the middle, but not to the superficial layers. So this indicates that indeed there is specific communication between CA2-3 and the deep layers of the parahippocampal cortex in the context of these predicted but omitted shapes, I should say. And there was even a hint of this going down further into the hierarchy with posterior CA2-3 communicating with the deep layers of the lateral occipital cortex, which is a visual cortical area known to represent complex shapes. So are these prediction signals that we see actually being sent back to cortex? Based on this evidence, I would say yes, they probably are. Okay, second question, how are expectations kept online? So I briefly highlighted this result earlier, where these templates of expected stimuli are active just before the actual stimulus appears. But what happens in the meantime in this interval between cue and stimulus? This information must be somewhere. So what's happening in this cue-stimulus interval? This is something that Dorothea in the lab, PhD student in the lab, is investigating. And she will be presenting a poster on this tomorrow morning, so I encourage you all to go there. She'll do a much better job than I will about explaining how she went about this. So to give you a quick idea of what she did, she used MEG to decode these shapes from the MEG signal, which worked very well. And she applied this to presented shapes. She tested the decoder on, sorry, she trained the decoder on presented shapes and then tested it on this cue stimulus interval where there are predicted shapes but not actually any presented shapes. And what we hypothesize is there might be some oscillatory component to these prediction signals. So that is presumably a much more efficient way of keeping these signals online than increasing the firing rate of these, whatever these neurons are, throughout the whole interval. So to test that, Dorothea applied the Fourier transform to the decoding time traces, the decoding of these predicted shapes, and then did a bunch of control analyses generating power spectra based on other types of decoders to check that this was significantly different from null. And found that indeed there's a strong alpha component to these traces, these decoding time traces of these predicted shapes prior to the stimulus appearing. And this was much stronger than in the shuffled decoder baseline. So it seems that these predictions of upcoming shapes oscillate at an alpha rhythm. Are those alpha oscillations, those stimulus-specific alpha oscillations, influential in terms of behavior? In this experiment, people did a very simple shape discrimination task. They had to say whether the two shapes that appeared were the same or different. And they were better at this task when the auditory cue correctly predicted the identity of the first shape than when it did not. And this expectation benefit was exaggerated when alpha power, stimulus-specific alpha power was high. So we did a logistic regression of pre-stimulus, stimulus-specific alpha oscillations, of oscillatory power against behavior. And when alpha power is high, people are better at the task when the expectation is valid. but they're worse at the task when the expectation is invalid. So what does this mean? So the full implications we're still trying to understand, but one thing that I think is interesting is that it seems in line with predictive routing theories of a version of predictive coding developed by Andre Bastos and Earl Miller, where the proposal is that the alpha and beta oscillations in the deep cortical layers carry predictions. And so the alpha beta frequencies here match that theory, but also the fact that these are proposed to be in the deep layers matches the earlier fMRI findings I briefly highlighted. So it seems that we have some converging evidence from fMRI and MEG that something like this might indeed be going on. Okay, question 3. Can expectations make us see things that are not actually there? This is work led by Joost, who is not at CNS. He is, in fact, at home with his newborn daughter, so congratulations to Joost. He led a set of studies actually, where again, auditory cues predicted upcoming stimuli, but here the difference was the stimuli were presented very fleetingly and they were very noisy to try to see if subjective perception was affected by these expectations. So in half of the trials there was a grating embedded in noise. On the other half of the trials there was no grating but only noise. And in this study, participants did not know about that. They didn't know there would sometimes be no grading at all. They also did not know what the cues meant. We tried to keep these things implicit here to avoid response biases. After the stimuli disappeared, they were asked to report which orientation the grating had and how confident they were that they had seen a grating. Firstly, I focus for the results just on these noise trials, because those are the ones that are specifically of interest to us. Firstly, on about 35% of these noise trials, people reported high confidence at having seen a grating, even though there wasn't one. So that's good news for us. But interestingly, these auditory predictive cues did not seem to influence which orientation they falsely perceived. So with the exception of a few participants who became aware of what the auditory cues meant, behavior wasn't biased by these predictive cues. And we think that these few people with a strong bias were probably displaying a response bias. So people have false percepts in this task, but these are hardly, if at all, determined by the predictive cues that we used. So what happens in the brain? Joost used layer-specific fMRI of the visual cortex to investigate this. Firstly, he found that the grating orientation predicted by the auditory cue was reflected in a stimulus-specific signal in the deep layers of the early visual cortex, in line with what we found before in a different study that I presented earlier. So there is an expectation signal in the early visual cortex, but it doesn't seem to impact behavior. So what about these false percepts, where people report seeing a grating with high confidence, even though there wasn't one? When they had low confidence, there was no stimulus-specific signal in the early visual cortex. When they had high confidence that they had seen a grating that wasn't there, this was reflected by a stimulus-specific signal in the middle cortical layers that are associated with feed-forward input from the lower order regions and thalamus, etc. So these expectation signals and these perceptual signals seem to be represented in different cortical layers, and perhaps that explains why the two don't interact in this case. So what are these stimulus-specific signals in the middle layers? We're not sure, but some candidates are random fluctuations in neural noise or lingering signals from previous trials, for instance. But the main question that we're interested in is what turns these random fluctuations into a percept? Because, of course, there's neural noise going on all the time, but we don't hallucinate all the time. So what turns them into a percept? Well, one thing that's important to note here is that people were very much expecting to see a grating. They didn't know there were noise-only trials, so they were very much primed to see gratings on every trial. And when Joost did an MEG version of this study, he found that prior to these high-confidence false alarms, there was an increase in alpha-beta power in the occipital parietal network compared to low-confidence responses. So perhaps, again, in line with the predictive routing theory, perhaps these reflect an expectation of seeing a grating, and when this expectation is particularly strong, the brain kind of runs away with any small sensory fluctuations and interprets them as a percept. So this is, of course, very speculative, but this might be one way in which this is happening. Okay, so to conclude from this study, expectations do not necessarily evoke false percepts, even if they evoke neural signals, which is probably a good thing, of course, for our day-to-day perception. So is there any role for expectations in hallucinations, in false percepts? I think there is, and I think there's at least two different ways in which that might be. So one is that these top-down effects are always only modulatory. They can't evoke percepts, but they can modulate processing. So you need some kind of sensory seed to start with. And if you have a very strong expectation that these small sensory signals are meaningful, as they were in the previous task, then you might run away with these small signals and turn them into a percept. Another possibility is that expectations maybe can drive percepts and turn into a full-fledged hallucination, but the expectations just in this study were just not strong enough. Maybe they need to be more overtrained, maybe they need to be hardwired, or maybe there's a role here for individual differences, that in people who hallucinate, these top-down signals can override the input layers, whereas in most individuals they usually don't. So lots of questions for future research in this topic, I think. So to conclude, what I hope to have shown you today is that the hippocampus generates predictions based on the statistical regularities in our environment. These are then fed back to the deep layers of the visual cortex, where they are embedded in alpha oscillations. And there they can modulate perception, bias perception of incoming sensory signals, but it's not clear that they can drive perception. So the take-home message that I would like to highlight from my talk today is that perception is not usually thought of as a passive bottom-up feature filter processing incoming signals, but an integration of top-down expectation signals with bottom-up sensory signals. So I'd like to thank a few people before I finish. So I would like to thank my PhD and postdoc supervisors, Floris and Nick, who have been amazing and still very supportive to this day, which I'm very grateful for. And the respective heads of our department at UCL when I was recruited, and now, which are Kathy and Martina, who've also been very welcoming to me in my new environment and helped me set up my group and supported me with all my research. And of course, I want to thank the people in the lab who did the actual research that I presented today, and all the people at UCL and elsewhere that we collaborated with. And thank the Chan Institute for sponsoring this award. Thank you for your attention. Okay, sure.
Hi, very nice talk. I wanted to ask a question about, I think it was the first main study you presented, where the sensory-specific predictions caused that negative representational similarity, or sort of repulsion of signal away from the target orientation grading, and you said it might be an inhibition effect. But then you showed that the informational connectivity of that effect on individual trials, how much it correlates with bold signal in specific hippocampal areas, was sort of a positive relationship. So I'm just trying to understand, is it the case, if sort of the suppression of the signal is useful, then wouldn't you expect that sort of a negative relationship in the informational connectivity, such that the more it goes up, the more sort of the representational pattern gets pushed away from its target?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this case, this was specific to the trials where there was a prediction, but the stimulus was omitted. And actually in the medial temporal region that was a target of the connectivity, the representation was also negative. So what might be the case is that these predictions are used to suppress predictable input. This is in line with a proposal by Helen Barron about what the hippocampus might be doing in the context of prediction, might actually be different from what it's doing in cortical reinstatement for memory retrieval, which is excitatory. Maybe in the context of prediction, it's inhibitory. So it's inhibitory in both the seed and the target in this case. That's why the connectivity is positive.
Oh, okay, thanks. That makes sense, and yeah, very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, so very exciting work. So a question on the predictions being done in the alpha band. So I think that's surprising, but also very interesting. Then I'm wondering, with respect to the hippocampus, doing the predictions, do you think it's a hippocampal theta switching to the alpha band, then also imposing this rhythm in the reinstantiation? And if so, should we also think about midbrain areas like the septum being involved in driving the whole predictory machinery?
Yeah, great question. Septum, I haven't considered, to be honest, but I think indeed the role of the hippocampus in this study will have to clarify further. So we expected that maybe we'd see theta oscillations, for instance, as Maria Wimber has seen in the context of memory retrieval, but it turned out to be alpha. And we are starting to do some intracranial recordings now where we have hippocampal electrodes with the same kind of paradigm, so that we can actually directly measure what's going on in the hippocampus. And I wonder if indeed there might be a switch from hippocampal theta to visual alpha, or maybe there is even some hippocampal alpha involved. I'm not sure, but it's very much a question that we're interested in following up. Thanks, Ole.
I predict a large round of applause for Peter.